Dumelang bagaetsho. My name is Thapelo. I'm the managing director at Mmegi. I wish to take this opportunity to welcome everyone, those who are joining us by Zoom, others following proceedings on the Mmegi Facebook channel. Wherever you are, we are happy to have you tonight. Karibuni sana. Mmegi, in partnership with the Botswana Society, have been hosting a public forum series on the impact of COVID-19 in Botswana and its likely effects in the long run. We began our series earlier this year in March with a focus on media and benefited from a lively and productive discussion from print and radio journalists, private and government publishers, as well as freelancers. In April, we highlighted the education sector's response to COVID, with perspectives from administrators in higher and secondary education and a leading teachers union. These forums have been highly successful in reaching a wide audience, both those listening live over Mmegi's Facebook channel or visiting the video on the same platform. But first, the overall picture. Here, now for 14 long months, the COVID pandemic has gripped Botswana and the rest of the world, cutting across all age groups, classes, and nations, often bringing to a halt our habits of living, working, interacting with others, earning a living, or traveling, even short distances. Well-intended precautions have forced us all to behave abnormally, changed the workplace, disrupted families, isolated individuals, and instilled suspicion of others. Soon, we hope it will end as more vaccines arrive, infections drop, and restrictions are eased. Nevertheless, what lays beyond COVID is uncertain, for in the recent months, businesses have closed, unemployment has soared, incomes and livelihoods have disappeared, and health and social problems have increased. What, in other words, can we expect the recovery from COVID to look like? The Zoom forum series on COVID's impact engages with persons who have been dealing with COVID and who have the responsibility for coming up with answers. Each one of them occupies a position in society that has placed them in the path of COVID, changed the lives of their colleagues professionally, and left them pondering what lays beyond the dark months of the pandemic. What have they learned from the pandemic that is likely to determine how they function in the future? Has their profession and perspective pre-COVID been changed permanently? Can they recover what they had in hand before, or revive as the persons they used to be? Or has their profession shifted course and shaping them in unforeseen ways? Today's forum deals with COVID and Botswana's economy. This broad topic will be covered over 3 forums, beginning with Botswana and the global economy tonight, followed in the weeks to come by Botswana's formal economy, and later, Botswana's informal economy. We hope you can follow us for each of these. I now hand over to our discussion leader, Cathy of GabzFM, known to many of you who tune in talk radio, to introduce the topic of Botswana in the global economy, as well as the 4 preeminent panelists who have agreed to share their perspectives with us tonight. Take it away, Cathy.
Thank you so much, Titus. And again, thank you to Mmegi as well as the Botswana Society for putting together this important public forum series. And kudos to the Botswana Society for going online and partnering with Mmegi to do so. And of course, welcome to you who are joining us live. This is on the Mmegi Facebook page live stream. So, Titus has already talked about the fact that we are assessing COVID's impact on Botswana's economy, and dealing with this very broad topic, it's complex. So that's what he's already mentioned. We've decided to break it up into three different fora. And tonight, talking about Botswana and looking at the aspect of Botswana and the global economy, trying to look at how perhaps our nation is placed in the broader context. And from there, are also hoping to have a look at Botswana and the domestic formal economy, and later on as well, looking at the informal economy. So we're hoping and trusting that you will join us for all three of these sessions. Now, a recent intelligence report from The Economist observed, and I want to quote this: the coronavirus, that is the COVID-19 pandemic, has had a devastating impact on the global economy. So to tackle the outbreak, developed countries have unleashed record high amounts of fiscal stimulus, and what they've also done is published and pushed public debt ratios to unprecedented levels. Meanwhile, long-term growth prospects are grim, raising questions about the sustainability of such high debt levels and the implications of the current situation for the economies around the world. And there we close the quote. Now, some of the issues that arise over COVID-19's impact on Botswana's relationship with the global economy, we have things when we look at the government revenue traditionally being dependent on our mineral exports, of course, particularly diamonds, while private as well as public offshore investments have outdistanced tight liquidity in the domestic bourse. So questions naturally arise as to what effect on Botswana has the global economic downturn caused, and this is what we're looking, what COVID and the contrary movements of equity markets. We want to also interrogate how these shifts have influenced Botswana's responses, and we want to know if they've revamped the approach that will be likely to be taken in the future. So global pent-up demands, we want to look at whether they spell stimulus for investments in Botswana. We also want to know if this Botswana stock exchange is moving in new directions that promise some sort of greater external participation. So this evening, we've got four panelists who are going to be helping us to reflect on this past year dealing with COVID-19, and hopefully also help us to look into and foresee new patterns that are likely to emerge post-COVID-19. Our panelists represent the financial management sector, they represent the diamond economy, and our nation's central bank, as well as the stock exchange. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very good evening to you. I am your host, the village chick with plenty shake. Cathy Malejane. And as Titus has already said, I'm not here alone. I am here with four panelists. I want to take my time to introduce and welcome all of my panelists. So our first one is Dr. Pako Thupayagale, and Dr. Pako is the portfolio manager of 91. Dr. Thupayagale, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Cathy. It's a pleasure and honor to be here.
We also have Ms. Naseem Lahri, who is the Managing Director of Lucara Diamonds, and I believe huge congratulations coming your way. There's an exciting stone that's recently been found. Thank you so much for joining us, and good evening to you, Naseem.
Good evening, and thank you. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
We also have the Governor of the Bank of Botswana, Re Moses Pelaelo. Governor, welcome.
Thank you.
And then our fourth panelist is CEO of Botswana Stock Exchange, Re Thapelo Tsheole. Re Tsheole, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Dr. Thupayagale, we're going to begin with you as a portfolio manager at 91. We would like to find out how the challenges ushered, or how you confronted the challenges ushered in by COVID-19. Some markets actually experienced surprising gains, and I want to know whether you counted yourself amongst the lucky ones.
Thank you, Cathy. That's a great question. It's also a very complex question, and my response will be couched in respect to domestic capital markets, and then followed by a bit on global capital markets. In the domestic context, without a doubt, the outbreak of the COVID pandemic exacerbated existing trends from an asset allocation perspective. And to be more precise, as you all know, our leading equity benchmark, the DCI, has been on a downtrend for the last 5 years. The advent of COVID simply exacerbated that trend. Key companies reported material earnings downgrades. And just to give you a bit more flavor, travel restrictions clearly impacted adversely on tourism counters. They in turn reported significant earnings declines. The financial sector was hit by downgrades with respect to asset quality and related credit impairments. As a consequence, this had impacts on their top line and ultimately relatively weak bottom line. Retailers were faced by a very cautious consumer, and as a consequence, buying power was muted given prevalent uncertainties. The key point being, in a context of uncertainty, in a context when the outbreak first occurred, the policy response was a bit uncertain. But over time, the policy response became stronger, and its robustness and its scope and its direction had the positive effect of, over time, improving sentiment, supporting a cyclical recovery, and boosting valuations. So from a very top-down perspective, policy stimulus, both fiscal and monetary in Botswana, played a key role in improving sentiment. Globally, the same is true, but is perhaps more amplified, just given the unprecedented and the synchronized response to the pandemic. At the end of last year, global stock markets experienced significant declines in the order of 20 to 30%. However, over the subsequent months, global equity markets have recovered very strongly, and we're seeing key equity indices like the S&P 500 now at record highs. And generally, the tone of the market remains very favorable to continued robustness of this asset class. So from a financial market perspective, or in particular capital market perspective, locally and globally, we have seen some gains, but clearly there's a big differential. The local market has its own idiosyncratic dynamics, which prevent it from staging the sort of recovery we're seeing globally. But nonetheless, from a domestic market perspective, we can say domestic bonds, domestic equities are trading at very attractive valuations. And from my perspective, they present significant buying opportunities. On the other hand, globally, we're seeing global stock markets trading at very hot levels. The good thing is that we're seeing a rotation to more cyclical stocks. This in turn provides an opportunity for investors to realize significant capital gains on sectors that were previously downplayed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thupayagale. I think I'd like to move to you, Lahri, and coming in from Lucara and seeing, diamonds. And by the way, again, congratulations. I believe there was a 470-carat diamond recently discovered at Karowe mine. So again, congratulations to you on that one. But, difficult waters, definitely. I think diamond sales have declined. And I want to know, during COVID, what have been the major challenges that Lucara, as well as the diamond industry in general, have had to face?
Thank you for the question. I think for us, like everyone else in the world, the uncertainties around COVID specifically from my end, just the buying powers and on the international side. So the closing of the airspaces, and, Pako very eloquently stated the fact that, the policies were very slow in being generated. So we found ourselves in a lockdown and we didn't know how to operate. Specifically from the mining industry, information was coming slow. So yes, we were an essential service, but how do you operate? So as an organization, we were faced with a lot of changes occurring specifically from a health side, which we'd never experienced. And I don't think anyone here on the panel would have anticipated being in a pandemic or leading in a pandemic and, dealing with a lot of people as well. It just, from a safety perspective, it brought a very new dynamic and a very complex dynamic into play. And the guidelines were very key for us. So when I talk about the pandemic and lockdowns, I don't understand what a lockdown is, because as the mining industry, we weren't in a lockdown, but we didn't have any guidelines, right? So we had to work along with information from the CDC and our risk management teams, create crisis management teams, and understand how we were going to bring our people on board. Again, our people in the mining industry were considered essential service, right? So everybody else was staying at home while we were bringing our guys into the firing line, where we weren't sure what COVID was about. We didn't know how the infection rates were going to look like, but thank God we had a good operation. We had implemented the right rules and regulations. But I think for us, the biggest challenge initially was, how do we work in a COVID environment without any guidelines? As we moved out of the lockdowns, it was fairly simple because the guidelines were coming in very, very quickly. But for us that were working in the environment, we didn't have clear guidelines at that point. So we had to develop guidelines looking at what the world was doing and so on and so forth. Again, yes, we're allowed to operate. And the biggest issue for us was to actually manage the welfare of our individuals or the people working in our environment. So welfare was very key. So we understood what we needed to do. We understood that we needed to work because we were an essential service. So we hadn't stopped. Our operations didn't stop. But we had to deal with what was happening internationally. The airspace was closing out. And as you all know, diamonds have to be sold out of the country. People weren't coming in. So we had to deal with those challenges. Yes, we were producing, but how do we sell our diamonds? But with every organization, with challenges coming on board, you create opportunities. For us, we had a great online sales platform, which we used to actually sell us. Our clients couldn't come into Botswana, but we were able to sell our diamonds, which was very unique to other diamond operations, right? But the fact that the airspace was closed was a big issue for us, and the fact that we have international clientele as well. And obviously, internationally, COVID was spreading at a rapid speed. Likewise, in Africa, but obviously slower in Africa, but internationally, it was a big, big problem. I think for us, what really helped us was the discussions with the ministry, specifically in terms of, okay, what happens after the lockdowns? Yes, we're selling through our online platforms, but what do we do with the diamonds that we've currently produced? Because we are still operating. What do we eventually do with our diamonds, and how do we sell them? So I think there was a big, big collaboration with the government to understand that we couldn't sell locally here, specifically because people couldn't come in because of the restrictions that they had, the travel restrictions right the way through the world, the lack of flights coming into Botswana, the lack of flights going out of Botswana as well. So there was a lot of complexity around actually selling our diamonds locally here in Botswana. But I think, the government was very, very flexible with us, specifically in the diamond industry. I can't talk to the other industries here specifically, but with the diamond industry, because of the input we have to the bottom line of the country, they assisted us to facilitate diamond sales out of the country. So currently, how we're actually dealing with the challenges that we see in terms of the revenue is, yes, we have the diamonds. The demand is there. There's no issue around demand and polishing. The issue was around getting the diamonds out of the country. We currently have an arrangement with the government, and so does De Beers. We are actually selling our diamonds through Antwerp, and for De Beers, they're actually going through to Dubai. So we do have sites in Antwerp specifically for Lucara, Botswana. We sell on an online platform. And what also assisted us through the pandemic, specifically in relation to our sales, was we took the risk. So I talk about challenges that we faced with COVID, but we created opportunities out of that, specifically on our sales platform. And what we did was we actually went into an arrangement which no sane company would do in a pandemic, but we did it because we were looking at the opportunity that we'd get out of the polished environment. So we went into an arrangement with a company called HP, who actually took our 470 carat diamond to polish, right? So when we got into that arrangement, the polished environment was actually flourishing at that point in time. Yes, we went through a lockdown, but at the time that we went into the lockdown, we went into an arrangement with HP to polish our diamonds 10.8 carats and above. And the government allowed us to actually get our diamonds out of the country, even though flights were restricted. We were able to bring in a flight to take all our goods out at that point in time, which was through the lockdown. So we had inventory that was eventually polished when the lockdowns were being uplifted and people were able to actually go out and purchase diamonds. We were actually now in the business of selling polished diamonds, which actually assisted us as Lucara Botswana, not to keep afloat, but to be in the market, in the polished market, and also not see a drastic reduction in our revenue. So I think the reaction of the management team, as well as the reaction of the government to our requirements, assisted us to stay afloat and also assisted us to keep up with the demand that actually came out the minute the lockdowns were released, right? So I think for us, in as much as COVID was a challenge, we had great assistance from the government in relation to the policies and the discussions that we had around selling our diamonds, and also the quick decision-making processes that occurred at the government level to assist us to get into arrangements that were never there before, obviously to get into the polished arrangement, as well as to get our diamonds out. So that assisted us a lot. And I guess also from a people perspective, what really helped us with respect to the lockdowns was to see that, you know, within the first month of the lockdown, people understood that COVID, in as much as it was a health risk, we were managing it well. So I think the information that we had from the Ministry of Health and the DHMTs in the areas assisted us to actually equip the organization to actually get proper protocols in place to ensure that we could work in a lockdown and work safely with the environment that we were in. Thank you.
Thank you, Naseem. I want to now turn to Pelaelo, Governor of Botswana and Overseer of Pula, which is the National Sovereign Wealth Fund. Governor, we can assume that COVID has taken the Pula Fund and places it otherwise would not have gone. But we should note that the Pula Fund is rated near the top of Africa's sovereign wealth funds. What during COVID have been the major challenges facing the Pula Fund? Pelaelo.
Well, thank you very much, Cathy, and thank you very much, Botswana Society and Mmegi for inviting me to speak on the external sector performance. I think, first of all, the point to make—
Are you able to turn on your video? We'd like to see you as you're speaking.
Okay, I'm trying to.
Thank you.
Can you see me?
Yes, sir.
So I don't know why. Can you see me now?
No.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. It says,
yes,
okay.
Now we can. Yes.
Who can see me? Okay, thank you very much. Yes. Well, I was going to say the first point to make really is to say that, yes, you know, COVID-19 pandemic is the most devastating, shock to hit the global economy since the Great Depressions of the 1930s. But more importantly and significantly is really the impact on human life. Thus far, as you know, the pandemic has claimed over 3.6 million people lives globally, out of which more than 132,000 are from the African continent, and I believe over 885 from our country in Botswana. So these numbers indeed attest to the drastic toll on the human lives due to the COVID-19. But similarly, there is also a ravaging impact of the pandemic on the economies worldwide that is also unprecedented in the living memory. This is it's not really a normal recession, but a sudden stop, very much because of the containment measures. So I think that's the first thing to say. But having said that, despite all of that, the global economic growth is projected to rebound this year. Uncertainty, of course, surrounds the outlook, primarily related to the uncertain pace and coverage of the vaccine rollout, as well as the emergence of new variants of the COVID-19. So the strength of the recovery will depend very much on the trajectory of the pandemic itself, and of course, how well we do in terms of the vaccination programs. So from this perspective, Cathy, I think the impact of COVID-19 on Botswana as relationship with the global economy is quite relevant, important, and I think it's something that I want to emphasize. I think the other point to make is that the historical reliance of Botswana on diamond export revenue is common knowledge for all of us, but also the importance of taxes on imported goods, commonly known as the SACU revenues, and which are the two main sources of primary sources of revenue for government. So both of these factors had previously contributed to the positive balance of payments outcomes for this country, leading to the accumulation of the foreign exchange reserves. Now, with the advent of the COVID-19 shock, this hitherto strong external buffers has significantly deteriorated and could fall further in the absence of effective mitigation measures to address the situation. So, indeed, this has been a problem. As you know, we are a small open economy integrated with regional and global economies, and we are very much vulnerable to weak global demand affecting our exports, as well as global supply chains disruptions that are happening. We saw that, of course, with fuel and so forth. And more recently, this has manifested by the shock to the domestic economic activity occasioned by what we have seen. So now to rush to your point, because I wanted to give you this background, so the performance of the exports is a major influence and contributor to the overall growth prospects and government revenues. On the other hand, in addition to consumption, the import of capital goods and services is key to the development of productive capacity in the domestic economy. Another significant structural feature is the relatively large size and role of government in the economy, which influences private sector performance, employment, and other income generating opportunities. So in the past few years, the growth trajectory has generally been weaker than desirable, with notable transition to lower rates of output expansion, due in part to lack of traction in export diversification, even as mining's contribution to the overall output has been on the decline. And so this is something that we are looking at. So in terms of just the numbers, the Botswana economy in 2020 is estimated to have contracted by 7.9%, including a 26.2% decline in mining GDP and an overall 5.9% decrease in non-mining output, spread across all sectors except agriculture, which grew modestly by 2.3%. And of course, general government at 2.8%, water and electricity at 5.1%. The second one that I want to put is the deterioration in the external balance and the changing structure of our current account. So the external balance decreased from 12.6 billion or 6.1% of GDP, that is the balance of payment deficit in 2019, to 20.1 billion or 11.1% of GDP in 2020, as export earnings shrank by 14.4% against a 5.5% rise in the import bill. Notably, the diamond sales went down by 16.7%. However, the SACU revenues sustained us at about 15.6 billion compared to 14.1 billion in 2019. With respect to tourism, the 10 billion tourism-related revenue loss in 2020, as estimated by BTO, the Botswana Tourism Organization, which also oversees marketing and promotion of Botswana tourism. The losses have resulted from booking cancellations, following the March 2020 travel ban and national lockdown, which preceded the April peak period for the Botswana tourism. And by the end of April 2020, the drastically limited tourism activity had led to an estimated 90.7% closure of tourism enterprises and 8.1% loss of employment in the sector. The foreign exchange reserves themselves fell from 65.2 billion or 11.6 months of import cover at the end of 2019 to 53.1 billion at the end of March this year. That's 10 months of import cover. With the government share, that is the government investment account, decreasing from 18.3 billion in 2019 to 4.9 billion in the same period. So
Pelaelo, I need to pause you there.
yes, let me just give one number and then I'll pause here. Now, also a deterioration in the fiscal position as manifested by a widening of the government budget deficit from 12.6 billion in 2019-2020 to a projected 21 billion, that is 11.6% of GDP in 2021. And this is a result of the revenue shock. And let me stop here as a result, of course, of weak economic performance. Let me pause here and then I'll come back on policy responses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Let's now move to Thapelo and speak on COVID. We believe with any sort of issue or challenge, there's a silver lining somewhere. So I'm just assuming that COVID also created its own winners and losers in the local market. Thapelo, I want to know what during COVID have been some of the major challenges that the exchange has had to face.
Yeah, I think a pandemic by its definition leads to some consequences that trickle down to the stock market. And one of the first things that unfortunately we had to suffer as the local market is a massive sell-off by foreign investors. Ordinarily, when there's a global problem, even if the problem does not emanate from the local economy, most of the foreign investors will ordinarily sell assets or dump assets in emerging markets and frontier markets to invest in developed economies. And we're not spared of that. We saw massive flight in terms of the foreign investors. But the good thing about Botswana is that we have got a strong institutional domestic investor base who were able to easily absorb the stocks. The second point is the general trend in terms of trading volumes and levels. Globally, stock markets trading levels went down to about 61% in terms of the global equity market. And most interestingly also, you might realize that in Africa, the whole of Africa, not only in Botswana, there was not even a single IPO, initial public offering, that came to the market in the whole of Africa in 2020, which was something very, 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 very devastating also, given the fact that, as stock exchanges, we always want companies to come to the market to ordinarily offer our shares to the market. And therefore, in Botswana, we didn't have any equity listings. In the rest of Africa, there were 0 listings, IPOs, in the whole of 2020. But some of the effects also are just as a result of the pandemic. We had to be very flexible in dealing with the companies, especially in such things like submission of financial statements. Majority of the companies submitted their statements late. And then what we did as the local market is that we benchmarked what we do with other members of the World Federation of Exchanges. As you might be aware, as the BSE, we're an affiliate member of WFE, World Federation of Exchanges. And therefore, in response to the consequences or the effects of COVID on the regulatory framework on the market, we followed international best practices. We allowed some companies to bring or to submit their statement late without necessarily compromising the listing standards that we have. So we followed best practice in terms of what was. But most importantly, as the BSE, given the fact that the stock market by its nature is a platform where companies need to raise capital, either by issuing shares or by raising capital, I think we sufficiently played that role because we offered companies that were in cash demand to issue additional shares to raise capital in the market. Some companies successfully did that. I think the majority of the companies, an amount of about 100 million was raised through additional shares. And this was able to cushion the companies that are listed on the market against the possible consequences of COVID. And most importantly, we saw the increase in the debt issuance Private companies issued debt totaling about 465 million pula in order to cushion themselves against the consequences of COVID. And of course, government issued bonds up to 5.2 billion pula. So we saw the increase in the bond market, ordinarily so because it's in terms of crisis, it is more favorable to issue debt or to raise bonds than to issue equities or to issue additional shares. Because when you issue additional shares, when the prices are down during the pandemic, the amount of capital that you are going to raise is not going to be smaller because the prices are going to be smaller. In terms of the debt market, it's more favorable to issue debt or bonds because the interest rates presently are ordinarily down. And also, the central bank also reduced interest rates, and therefore it opened up a window of opportunity for companies to raise debt. And therefore, I think the consequences of the pandemic also, I think Pako explained them in terms of the equity index. I mean, we saw the domestic market equity going down by about 5.2% or so, which was not really massive when you look at the market experience. For the last 2 months, in April and in May, we have seen a slight increase in the domestic company index of about 0.6 and 0.5. And we hope the increase will be sustained post May and April. I think I'll stop there, and so that in the interest of time, I don't take a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tsheole. Now, that brings us to the end of our first segment, and I believe you can see our panelists indicating that Botswana's economy has been rattled by COVID-19, and well, as we'd expect, we want to now move on and look at signs, if any have been shown, of resilience. We will be asking each of them to look into a crystal ball, as it were, and forecast where they foresee the global economy's likely trajectory post-pandemic. And we want to see where that's going to take Botswana. We want to know, for example, what advantages as a medium income country, where does Botswana stand in terms of the anticipated post-pandemic recovery? I'm going to start once again with yourself, Dr. Thupayagale of 91. And I want to know, as Botswana enters the post-pandemic future, what scenarios is the financial management sector likely to encounter? You said, the impact or whether or not you gained or lost was sort of complicated, but now let's talk about post-pandemic. What do you see happening in the financial management sector?
Thank you, Cathy. I think the best way to approach the question is to take a top-down view, and that's a very macro view. So yes, we recognize that after a sharp contraction in 2020, we do expect a bounce in real GDP this year. So that's a fair point here, but I think it's more appropriate to take a longer term view, a medium term view, say 3 to 5 years from now. In that context, some of the volatility in the macro numbers is somewhat moderated. And in this context, the IMF forecasts average real GDP growth at around 4%. Historically, growth rates were significantly higher than this. And the key point really being that over the longer term, we do expect economic growth rates to slow. This in turn has consequences for labor markets, the extent of productive capacity in the economy. It also has a very strong bearing on the likely shape of capital market development. And in this context, our base case scenario is that the DCI should recover somewhat. But clearly this is contingent on the recovery not only being broad-based, but also being even. It also requires the private sector to be more aggressive, more innovative, not only in terms of generating earnings, but also in terms of products and sales and the overall quality of inputs and outputs. So that's critical. The extent of the private sector contribution is paramount to our longer term economic success. This in turn has bearings on asset markets. But the good news about the pandemic, which I'd like to highlight, is that we have seen increasing diversification, in particular in the debt market. We're seeing a lot more companies issuing debt, in other words, opening up their funding structures, their capital structures, which basically means going forward, there are a lot more opportunities for investors in that space. And the curious fact about our market is that over the past 3 years, debt markets have delivered generally stronger total returns than the equity market. Put differently, the debt market has been a very strong performer over the past 3 to 4 years. I expect this trend to continue going forward. And as a consequence, I expect opportunities in that space to continue to improve, particularly in a context where decarbonization, climate change are at the fore, both at a national level and also at an investor level. And the interplay of these trends offers potential, not only to diversify the economy, but also to grow our capital markets. And I think that's something we can be excited about, notwithstanding the attendant risks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thupayagale. I think at this point, I want to sound out Lahri of Lucara. And I can imagine that social distancing, we're all hoping will eventually fade, and we go back to couples thinking of getting married. And I believe, just as Dr. Thupayagale was talking, you too expect that the diamond sales will bounce back up. You've mentioned that the demand is still there. The challenge is just, the transportation, the logistics of getting the diamonds to the buyers. So apart from such revenues, what scenarios in the diamond and mining industry become possible? This is now as Botswana enters the post-COVID, the post-pandemic future.
Thank you for the questions. Good question as well. I think for me, in my crystal ball, I think, it's a very optimistic outlook, and I'll be cautiously optimistic in saying what I'm saying right now. But I think for us, like I said, the industry has opened up, with the vaccine programs that are being rolled out overseas, specifically in Europe, the Americas, and that sort of thing. We are seeing a big uptake, and I'd say it's a hot market right now, specifically around diamonds, because the European markets are open right now. We are able to sell at the moment. I think for us, it's a different scenario because we can get the product out, right? And we're able to sell in platforms overseas, being specifically in Antwerp and in Dubai and wherever else we're allowed to sell. So the markets, even with the Indian variant coming through, or the Delta variant coming through, it has impacted, but not as much as we expected, specifically because the market is hot. And those companies that are polishing in India have other polishing entities in Antwerp and Dubai as well. So they were able to have a contingency plan in place for what is happening in the country that they're living in, right? But I think in saying that, for us to bring, and I'm going to divert a bit to be a little bit more diverse in the conversation from a tourism perspective, because a lot of our site holders used to actually physically come into Botswana and purchase the diamonds. We're not going to see that happening anytime soon, specifically because our rollout of the vaccine, for us, I think our silver bullet is the rollout of the vaccine programs. So as soon as we get that up and running, and when Botswana gets out of the red sort of listed countries, we'll see that uplift coming in, even in the tourism industries and the diamond industry, because then we can bring the sales locally here to Botswana. And I think the ideal situation is for us, yes, we have a hot market, but our diamonds are not being sold locally here. We're taking them out of the country and we're selling them out of the country. And gradually, I mean, I'm sure for the viewers on the current panel that are viewing the current panel right now, you can see that De Beers have smaller parcels out there, but their prices are going up. So all the producers are actually increasing their prices. The diamond pricing has gone up. And for those who follow the luxury market, most of the luxury markets out there had increased their prices from 15 to 20% in a pandemic, in a black swan event, they increased their prices and people were buying. So what has happened is people are actually, they have a lot of excess cash right now. Disposable income is not an issue because they've been in lockdowns, they haven't been able to move around. So they have a lot of cash to spend. And that's why we call it a hot market, because the cash is there, they're willing to spend it. So I think for us, for it to be optimal for Botswana, right now we are seeing we're seeing a good market for diamonds. It's hot right now. We are actually taking our diamonds out of the country. The government has allowed us to do that up until December. But I think for us as a country, the rollout of vaccines is definitely a silver bullet for us, because if we can get out of that red listed country list, it makes it easier for people to come to Botswana. Because right now, even the local companies are not actually viewing our diamonds because they still have to get their diamonds out of the country to polish. So I think for us in the industry, just to see the industry growing locally and to see the economy growing locally as well, yes, we're selling our diamonds, but we'd rather sell them locally here in Botswana. And for me, I think the important bit is that, yes, the market is hot, but I'd rather sell my diamonds locally. And therefore, for me, it's about opening up the market here. And for us to see that market opened, I think, we'll talk about it, and I'm sure a lot of the other individuals will talk about it. The silver bullet for us right now is to move from that red listed country to something that is more amber and green. And you can see the world is opening up, Europe is opening up, the US is opening up, specifically because they have been vaccinated and they're more comfortable, right? So, and travel is a lot easier in those countries. And I think for us, it's to facilitate better travel to Botswana and out of Botswana as well. And for me, like I say, the diamond industry is slowly coming up, and you can see it, the markets are hot. I talked about the luxury industry, increasing prices as opposed to reducing. You're seeing De Beers increasing. Our prices generally for the large stones in the polished market have also gone up. So the market is hot. We're very optimistic about the market, and we will see the revenues coming up, and they won't come up like immediately, but gradually will come up, and we'll see that hot market equating into the revenue bottom line of Botswana as well. But I think for us, we need to focus on, yes, we can sell the diamonds, but how can we sell them locally? And for me, that is a bit of a challenge because we're closed in at the moment. People don't want to travel to Botswana, specifically because we're a red country. People have to quarantine when they get home and that sort of thing. So if we can get out of that from a vaccination program perspective, I think things will look really good for us. Yes, the industry is looking up, but I think locally in the market here, we need to make sure that we get that traction, specifically looking at us moving out of that red zone or red listed country to something more amber or green. Thank you.
Imagine, like you said, that then becomes a win-win because people don't just come here to buy the diamonds. You mentioned tourism, because then it sort of feeds as well into that sector as well.
Of course, yes, definitely.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Naseem. Let's now move to Thapelo Tsheole from Botswana Stock Exchange and look at, well, when Botswana finally turns its back on COVID-19, I want to know, according to you and your crystal ball, what you think the stock exchange is likely to encounter. And I want to know also what you think local investors are looking to the future. What is it looking like in your crystal ball?
Yeah, I think, look, I think from where I'm sitting, we have seen increased interest in some of the companies coming to the market, because one of the greatest lessons that I think most of the local business people learned is that, COVID just came a month and then everything just went upside down. And therefore, I think there's a slight change in terms of mentality that, people need to diversify their investment in terms of, if you own a business, no matter how small it is, I think you need to be able to diversify it in such a sense that share the risk with other people by ultimately aiming to bring this company to the market. And that is why, for us, we have been running this CPD mentorship program for 2 years now, where we have been teaching small, medium enterprises in this country that, ultimately, the best corporations in the world are listed ones. And this is where we really need to be developing our business to ultimately aim to expand it. And we have seen a good response in that respect. But I think in terms of the listings pipeline, we have seen an increased interest in the listings in Botswana, both by domestic companies and international companies. In fact, I think we already have at our hand a AAA rated international institution that wants to list product in our market. And also, generally speaking, I think we have seen some level of innovation in terms of diversity in the products that are going to be coming in the BSE. I think it's going to be very interesting going forward. In any case, I think if you look at the structure of our market, it's in such a sense that, you know, foreigners have always been participating in our market at a level of about 46 to 55% of turnover levels was accounted for by foreigners. And therefore, if I discount the effects of the grey listing that we experienced as a country, I think if that can be corrected, we'll still see some foreigners coming back to play a role in our market. And the DCI at some point will recover, like Pako said. But I think the best performance was the debt market, the bond market, because the stock market is not only equities. There's equities, there's bonds, there are exchange traded funds. We actually have the gold exchange traded fund that had about 35+% returns to investors. And therefore, I think investors, both individual and institutional, will look at the diversity in terms of the products, and people will not only want to come to the stock market only thinking about shares. They must know that there's bonds, there's exchange traded funds, and we are looking at introducing some of the instruments like global depository receipts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thapelo. And I love the fact that both you as well as Dr. Thupayagale are optimistic the DCI will come up. So let's hope the way you're looking through the crystal ball is correct. Yeah?
Thank you.
All right, now let's move to you. We're saving the best for last. Governor Pelaelo, we want you to also look into that crystal ball and talk to us about Botswana entering the post-pandemic future. I'd like to know what scenarios the Pula Sovereign Wealth Fund is likely to encounter, according to you. Governor?
Thank you. I want to make sure that I have focus on things that can help for us to rebuild our external buffers. And clearly, I mean, as you know, the global markets, you know, there's been equities rally and all kinds of challenge, interesting things and so forth. But what's happening to our Pula fund now is a lot to do with this prospect for this economy. And I think that's what we need to focus on. So the first thing to note is that the global economy is projected to recover, anchored on effective vaccine rollout, as we have just talked about, and maintenance and continuing policy stimulus, of course, and even across regions and regions. So the World Economic Outlook, as you know, is that the global economy will grow by 6% in 2021, and Botswana 8.3%, and so forth. And these are very important numbers to bear in mind. But there are two things to say. If you flash back, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit Botswana, the policy response, the authorities adopted counter-cyclical policies to cushion the economy and safeguard employment, and in addition to health and life-saving measures, of course, several support measures to make sure that the businesses and so forth are sustained. That deep into the resources, into government savings. And that's something that we need to remember. Now, in terms of what's the prospects, there is a limited window of opportunity for Botswana. Thus far, this economy, the business model that we have is that of high dependency on government, and secondly, on mining and related activities. Now, clearly that has sustained us thus far, and created what we have. But there is a need, and of course, to talk about changing the policy design and the business model that we have to do. So what is going to happen to the Pula Fund will depend on how well we do in terms of export diversification. So the most important policy agenda within this limited window of opportunity is to make sure that our export-led industrialization involves large-scale industries that are integrated into the global value chains, thereby enhancing economic diversification and our domestic industry competitiveness, as well as expanding market opportunities and the export base. So that will then generate the foreign exchange reserves that we require. This will certainly improve the economic resilience that we are looking for. The second one is digitalization. Harnessing of information and communication technologies as an effective and value-adding influencer of economic activity is going to be critical in terms of building the resilience that we are looking on. This, of course, will require improving availability and affordability of internet, developing the critical mass of digital skills, and certainly deliberate facilitative posture towards new technology and issues. The other issue, of course, is to make sure that we rebuild this fiscal and external buffers. We have to go through fiscal consolidation. And it's important that our track record of prudent fiscal policy making, adherence to fiscal rules, fiscal discipline that and the institutional frameworks continue to be there for us to be able to deal with this. So the reason why we fared better than many countries in dealing with the COVID-19 is because of the existence at the onset of the pandemic of strong fiscal buffers, demonstrating rather strong fiscal and external buffers. This was very, very important, and that helped us to support the future, the stabilization, as well as giving us the policy discretion to deal with this. But what we need to do now to rebuild, one of them is enhanced domestic resource mobilization through improved tax efforts. We have sufficient taxable capacity, and if we can optimize in terms of coverage, in terms of limiting exemptions and improving collections, that should be very well, as well as cost recovery, level tariffs for our utilities and government services, because some of these utilities are the ones that are eating away from the Pula Fund. Of course, we need to sustain the government bond issuance market. We need to develop domestic capital markets, and including the bond government market. This is an important one. The government has raised the ceiling. We can go on up to 15% of GDP. And this is what we need as a critical mass. And that will be resources that we can tap into. If you take, for example, our pension industry, it is 100 billion Pula pension industry. And about 60% of those resources are invested offshore. They are not part of the official reserves. They are national reserves, but they are offshore. They are not within the official reserves. And so if we can do something in our bond issuance program to attract those savings, then that will help us. The other issue, of course, with respect to the Pula Fund is that we need to improve in terms of the withdrawal rules and governance. And we are having a conversation around what we should be doing to ring-fence the Pula Fund for durable preservation or part of the foreign exchange reserves and maintenance of an investment portfolio with the bias towards higher return investments. Clearly, diversification of the economy to expand the tax base and sources of export earnings are things that we require. But of course, I want to end on a note of emphasizing the maintenance of good macroeconomic policy framework to safeguard macroeconomic stability and adherence to our fiscal rules. Those are the things that will preserve the Pula Fund. I thank you.
Thank you so much. And I had really wanted us to engage and let whoever's watching and the listeners to also engage and send us questions, but we have run out of time. But I do believe that every minute was absolutely worth it. So I want to thank, first of all, our panelists for taking their time, not only to prepare for this occasion, but also to be here and to take part in this conversation. I really sincerely wish we had more time. I feel like we just started. We should be continuing this conversation. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you so much for your time. And of course, I want to also thank Mmegi as well as the Botswana Society for hosting this forum and bringing it online. Digitization, as Governor Pelaelo has just been saying, I think this is one of the ways that we're starting to do that. We do hope you will be joining us for our future fora. We will announce the dates when we are working on, like we've already said, the domestic economy and also looking at the informal sector. And all in all, we're looking at COVID's impact on Botswana's formal economy, like we said, as well as the informal economy. And each of them will have different lineup of panelists. For now, I want to thank you again all so much for joining us, and do wish you all to continue staying safe and wish you a very good night. Thank you
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.